Hey, welcome firefighters. We're privileged to be here today to talk about a subject that I'm sure you guys know about, essentially scenario-based training. But we're going to call it motor performance and learning. And this last decade, researchers have learned more about our brain and how our brain operates under stress and how that has implications to how we make decisions. And really, regardless if you're a police officer, a firefighter, an ER doctor, a mountain climber, a fighter pilot, all of those professions have the same core nexus, making critical decisions under stress that have implications on our safety and the safety of our comrades. So today, we're going to look essentially at two main components, kind of this layering effect of training, and look at just some of the aspects of the brain. So in a sense, we're going to look at how do we learn, how are we taught, and ultimately, how do those things come together to shape our experiences that we can bring to our field of expertise?
We've learned quite a few lessons in working with our officers, and we want to share some of those lessons. Some of the material that we'll be presenting today isn't going to be specific or particular to firefighting from a technical aspect, but rather there'll be concepts that you can apply towards your training, using your specific knowledge and using your level of expertise to hopefully find ways to more effectively train your firefighters. Craig had mentioned earlier about a layered approach. The sports world has long used a layered approach in developing athletes. If you can think back to either when you were a kid playing sports, first learning an athletic endeavor, or if you're a parent and you're coaching some athletics, we start out generally teaching our kids or learning an overall understanding of the sport, the rules, the actual specific peculiarities of each position on a team, basically understanding the gist of the sport itself. Then from there, we start to develop independent or individual skills that are used within the actual game itself. That level of drilling is often done repetitively, and in the beginning, oftentimes without context. So if I'm playing catch out in front of my street, I'm actually getting a lot of valuable information out of playing catch. I'm learning the timing, the feel, the actual physical actions of catching a ball, and I may not yet relate it to how this is going to work out in the actual sport, but I'm getting value to it. Same is true with throwing. Now in law enforcement, and I'm sure in firefighting as well, we learn individual skills in the same way. And sometimes for us in law enforcement, those skills are represented on a firing range or on mats for defensive tactics. And those particular skills are oftentimes drilled over and over again in the hope that we can master them. And many people talk about muscle memory, and we'll talk later about some of the concepts around that. But the basic gist of it is that the more repetition we do, the more effective we are with it. We do have to think in terms, though, at some point, shifting gears. In the sports world, we'll have quite a bit of time to practice our basics, to work on our fundamentals. In law enforcement, and I'm sure it's the same in firefighting, we're going to have a limited amount of time for which to be able to train our people. Since time is limited, it becomes very important to shift gears, from just learning the basics to adding context to those basics. So drills need to start having yet more context to reflect the duties that we do out in the real world. Like our sports analogy, catching a ball, throwing a ball, once we start understanding how to do those actual physical skills, we start applying them different as the athlete gets better. All of a sudden, catching a ball might be catching a ball from the position of shortstop and having to throw it to first base. So we start building in context, actual situations that people see in games. This aspect of training for law enforcement and for firefighting is one that traditionally we don't spend enough time on. Fundamentals are important, and revisiting fundamentals and basics has its place. But with a limited amount of time to train officers and firefighters, it's important that when we revisit these fundamentals, we build in more and more context. In the law enforcement world, revisiting the basics will often involve, at a firing range, unholstering your weapon, getting your weapon set down range, and then accurately shooting at a cardboard target. When we look at that in the context of a real-life gunfight, it doesn't play out that way. So revisiting these basics are important. Getting your weapon out of holster in a timely manner is very important in a gunfight. However, when we revisit that basic, it's important that we start adding context to it. So what we previously had done in a vacuum of drawing our weapon, now maybe we can do drawing our weapon and moving simultaneously as we're getting our weapon up on target. Now, this isn't a full-blown scenario, but those skills we're layering up so that they reflect the context of a gunfight on the street. And I give you this example as a law enforcement professional. In the firefighting world, I am sure you will have many examples that you can put in place of this one. As we build on these fundamentals with more and more context, much like an athlete, we're working our way up towards more lifelike encounters, like scrimmaging as an athlete. Craig will talk a little bit more about competing at the speed of the game.
I appreciate Berto's segue into that. He doesn't tell you that he was a professional athlete. And when you talk to a lot of professional athletes, what they say is when they first start into the sport, it's not when they move up into the professional leagues that the complexity of the game is necessarily challenging. It's not that learning all the different aspects of the game is challenging. It's the speed at which that game plays out. That same corollary of speed, the corollary of speed plays out certainly in firefighting and certainly in law enforcement. So our end goal is how do we maximize, how do we exploit those seconds in time that we can become most proficient? The question is, how much mastery do we have to have over the skill to then move on? We've all heard the common axioms that it takes 20,000, 30,000 reps to make something automatic or more of muscle memory. That's really kind of a misnomer. There's no question we have to have that foundation, but ultimately we're going to have to build upon that mastery of skill sets to then rely upon that information for us to perform under stress. That historical approach, often referred to as the behavioral sciences approach, is one that looks at just constant repetition to build skill mastery. We need to move past that. We need to now add a different layer on top of that we can access under stress. That behavioral approach has been around since the 1980s. That specific style of training those professions that deal with stress has been around for 30, 40 years. What we've learned in this last decade, we've moved way beyond that. And so our hope is through this presentation is to talk about a couple of key areas that we now can kind of change that paradigm and move on to kind of a next level of more efficient training. And I can't stress this enough. I mean, you're hearing from law enforcement officers here, but we have tremendous respect for your profession. And again, it's regardless of whether you're a police officer, a firefighter, in the end, we are all tasked with making those difficult decisions under stress. So our hope is as we work through this presentation, you'll have a couple of key takeaways that you can take back and look at your training and hopefully move it in a direction that works for all of your crews. Okay, let's take this moment and kind of talk about our brain, that 3-pound lumpy squishy mass between our ears that has tremendous influence and implications on how we act. Certainly we know some of the functions of the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. What we're primarily looking at today is how does the sympathetic nervous system, once it's enacted, how does that have influence over our actions? And really, primarily, we're going to look at the sympathetic nervous system. That's the portion of our brain that kind of kicks in. It's what we often refer to as the fight or flight mechanisms. It's the part of our brain that allows us to perform under stress, and in some ways can be debilitating under stress. So let's take just a little walk through our brain. Right up front here, we have our frontal cortex. That's where a lot of our rational thought, where we think about things, where we rely upon past memories and experiences. We access our frontal cortex of our brain when there's not a lot of stress. Right along the side of the brain is the temporal lobe. And in the middle of that temporal lobe, or essentially right on top of the brainstem, you have a very unique set of structures, and one we're going to look at is the amygdala. Amygdala comes from the Greek word almonds, but you have two of them back there. And those amygdalas, or the amygdala in and of itself, is critical in how we perform under stress. And as we'll talk about later, if we can't manage the amygdala, that can actually hijack our performance under stress. So what we want to do is we want to understand the role of the amygdala so that when we come under stress, how does the amygdala reach into the frontal cortex, rely upon past memory and experience, and then pull that back into our psychomotor skills to where we're able to perform quickly, efficiently, and effectively under stress. And the flip side of that, the amygdala can also hijack and cause us to freeze in some situations. And I want to put maybe just a quick note there. I think certainly dealing with law enforcement professionals and training, I don't think we like to view ourselves as freezing. And I would say that we don't necessarily freeze. But what we do is we can take seconds, sometimes multiple seconds, 5, 6, 7, 8, trying to figure out the circumstance in which we're faced with. So that's really what I refer to as hijacking the amygdala. We want to not be hijacked by that physiological aspect of our brain and act quickly and efficiently. When we talk about kind of that first layer, building that repetition of skill sets, essentially skill mastery, those files essentially are stored in our frontal cortex. Again, the role of the amygdala serves two purposes. One, is it able to reach the frontal cortex, grab that information, what have we learned, what have we mastered, and then send that information to our muscular system so that we're able to act. We recognize that we're primarily giving you law enforcement examples, but you know what, in our fields, the transference of information, whether it's police or fire, the same takeaway is that we have to make those split-second decisions in those unenviable times. Now that we've got some of that brain neurophysiological stuff out of the way, let's talk about our 4 key things we want to give you today. First part of the layering process is establishing that intellectual understanding. What is it that we're supposed to know? What is it about the subject matter that we're supposed to have mastery over? We need to start with having that intellectual understanding. The next part of the layering process is the sterile drills. That's the part that we've talked about, that skill mastery. Learning through repetition, over and over again to where we have a good base, a good explicit system in place that we now can move upon. Probably the third component, which I think is the most overlooked, is this next layer, which we take what we've learned in the skill mastery phase and then apply that in some sort of context with some sort of emotional involvement. And why that emotional involvement is so critical is because it's that emotional involvement that starts to stimulate the amygdala, which allows us to set those memories in place so we're able to access them in the future. And finally, the last stage that we're all familiar with is the scenario training, which is really the testing component. Taking what we've learned all together and applying it in a full-blown scenario and seeing how we perform. Probably one, I would say, era that we've been in law enforcement is just historically, back in the 1980s, we had 4 troopers killed down in California. It's referred to as the Newhall shooting. And really about 1983, there was a huge upsurge and an emphasis on scenario-based training. And we've seen that through the 90s, simulation training, using simunitions, all sort of theatrical training in the context of scenario training. The problem is that we've taken the student or the officer and given them little training, I think, in kind of that middle realm, the contextual realm, and thrown them into a testing scenario. And in some ways, they haven't built those correct neural pathways from their amygdala to the frontal cortex, and I think it can almost create more confusion. And if nothing else, it can create inappropriate neural pathways. And again, really our intent here is that hopefully you can learn from law enforcement in this regard, not repeat some of the mistakes we did. With the price of simulators coming down in the fire service and kind of this resurgence of scenario training, hopefully you can take this information and apply that in your field.
So Craig's done a wonderful job of letting us understand just how we do perform under stress and the importance of actually building training that reflects that stress. He also talked about this first layer, this academic layer, the classroom layer. It's important when we roll out a classroom or an intellectual piece that it reflects the context of what it is we're trying to teach. Specifically, that lesson needs to pertain to the skills that we're going to learn shortly. It's got to pertain to the drills we're going to do to master those skills and give everybody in that class an overall understanding of what it is we're about to learn and how it relates to the problems that we see out in the road. As we create these lesson plans and roll out information, it's important that we give our personnel the ability to know what to look for. What to look for is basically what separates us as high performers out in the real world as opposed to people trying to actually perform skills without much context. To this point, sometimes we make the mistake of assuming that people will be able to perceive the same things all the time. I know from our world, in the police world, for instance, prior to doing my job, I used to be able to drive down the highway and not worry about seeing an expired registration tag. Now, when I'm out and about, even with my family, unfortunately, I Can't help but see them all around me. Did I see them before? I saw them, but I never perceived them. They didn't have meaning. What we try to do with good training is set it up on the front end so that people know what the meaning is of what it is we're about to learn. Another way to look at this is we simply need to be showing our students what it is they need to pay attention to as they go through the various layers of their training. For example, how we draw our weapon, or how you attack a fire hydrant. There are going to be particular things we want to pay attention to as we're learning it, and we set this up in the classroom phase. In summary, we need to know what we're doing, why we're doing it, and where it leads. As I've talked about in examples of drawing a weapon, attacking a fire hydrant, Craig had talked about it earlier, the misnomer that a specific set of or number of repetitions will automatically cause us to have muscle memory. It doesn't quite work that way. However, if we're purposely going at these drills at this basic level, we actually are building neural pathways. And as we practice them correctly, we actually myelinate those neural pathways. And an easy way to think of it is this. That pathway, once it's built, the more we myelinate it, the more efficient it becomes. So that I no longer have to be thinking about what I'm doing when I'm doing it. And by the way, I do know that muscles don't have memories. It's just a colloquial expression. These base layer skills that we talk about repetition on, that we're doing work with, when we first start, like all beginners, it's very explicit. I have to think of the steps in order to do them right. And I put more thought into the steps in the beginning so that I increase my fluidity in doing it. As we talked about myelinating these neural pathways. The hope is that there comes a time, as we all know, whether it's attacking a fire hydrant or drawing a gun, those two specific skills are not ever done in a vacuum. They're done in a world full of stress. Our hope is that these initial layers of practicing these skills deliberately will eventually lead to them being implicitly done and understood.
As I talked about before, this next layer, the third layer, is probably the most important. We've talked about that intellectual understanding, laying that base foundation of why we do something. We've talked about working with the drills and building that explicit system. Now comes the third phase, which we would call drills and context. Obviously, in the fire service, you do a great deal of training with patient extrication from vehicles. So if we look at just that domain of training, drills and context, maybe a way to look at it is once the firefighter has mastered those base skills of using the jaws of life and the various tools, and they understand those systems, then apply that in what would be kind of a low-level scenario. Just basically design a scenario that has a little bit of stress involved to it, a little bit of unknown, and that's going to start creating those neural pathways between the amygdala and the frontal cortex and providing for that more fluid psychomotor performance. And in a way that's almost intuitive. We know that we're not going to go from just an intellectual understanding or just that base level mastery of skills all the way to elite performance. We need to work in this middle zone. We need to have the firefighter work on those skill sets with some emotional involvement. A part of this layered approach is really to kind of manage the amount of stress we put on the performee. We want to give that in just enough doses to where they become familiar with it, to where they can allow their perceptions to work with what it is they're doing before we dump on a lot of stress in the scenario phase. And that's probably one of the reasons we haven't been successful in the scenario realm, is because we haven't kind of managed this middle ground of just practicing the skill set with some emotional involvement and stress. Let me come at it this way. We know that for us to make those split-second decisions under stress, we have to have memories. We have to have something in our frontal cortex that says, I've seen that before. I've experienced the ambiguity of that before. And the perfect place to create those file folders, those reference folders, are in this middle ground. But you can't do that if the student or the firefighter doesn't have an emotional connection or involvement to what it is they're learning. Look, here's the bottom line. You don't want to put on all the stress up front. You want to do it in managed doses.
Craig is exactly right. Building that stress incrementally so that the hope is when we encounter that giant dose of stress, we will have somewhat inoculated ourselves better to perform in a more efficient fashion. Understanding that all training is fake, we do rely upon scenario-based training to give us that best bit of reality that we can take from training. This is very important that we make our scenarios as close to reality as we can. The temptation oftentimes when designing scenarios is to make them far too grandiose, to have incidents that we would rarely see in a career. But rather what we want to do is capture the real life essence of those day-to-day, if not day-to-day, at least critical incidents that we come across that often challenge us. An unrealistic scenario for law enforcement is the lone officer taking on 100 armed criminals, where in reality, we struggle oftentimes on the day-to-day calls that are dangerous. Maybe it's a domestic with an armed person. We need to look at what fundamentals we can actually achieve in a reality-based scenario that can influence those kind of incidents. In the fire service side, I would imagine an unrealistic scenario would be an entire city engulfed in flames. But I am sure that just like in law enforcement, there's a lot to be gained from a stove fire that is rapidly evolving and getting out of control. It's how realistic can we make that experience, and what is it that we learned along the way that can influence that situation. Once we develop the concept for a realistic scenario, and we've done our work as trainers to make the ecology of that scenario as real to life as possible, we need to look not only at the performance of the officer or the firefighter in that scenario, we need to look at our training and see if the things that we are layering, the things that we've been trying to work on, are indeed working. This is very important, as too often all the focus is on the officer or the firefighter and their performance, and not enough scrutiny on the actual training itself to see if indeed we are modifying behavior. Part of that training evaluation needs to be, are these scenarios actually going to benefit the officer and or the firefighter? Because as students, we've all been there. Oftentimes there's a reluctance to even enter into the scenario for fear that it might become a situation where I might humiliate myself or not show as well in front of people as I'd like to. It's important to understand, though, that if you're doing these scenarios right, the stressors aren't going to be on the actual performance anxiety, but rather situational stressors that one would encounter in the real world. I talked a little bit about sports earlier. Panic and choking are two different things. When things go awry for us as emergency responders, it's because panic is set in. And oftentimes panic sets in because we haven't set the base as trainers to give our people relevant looks at those things that are most dangerous in our world. The stress the officer or the firefighter feels prior to entering your scenario oftentimes is more of a choking variety. Will I perform well in front of my peers? But if the scenario is set right, the stressors are going to put them in a situation where that voice goes to the rear, and it starts becoming the problem solving of the situation that comes to the forefront. When we achieve that, we've really achieved a home run in training. It's very important to always drive home the fact that training is where we want our mistakes to happen. Training is where we want our learning to happen. And training is a safe place for that to take place. Great scenario training goes beyond the day that you train it. If we do things right, your firefighters, like our officers, will be replaying that scenario in their head over and over again. And like Craig had talked about earlier, they're going to set the memories that ultimately reach out to that prefrontal cortex to bring about the actual behavior that will win the day.
Roberto touched on a key point there when he was talking about designing and the purpose of scenarios, and that is, what are we paying attention to? Dr. Robert Nidifer was a sports psychologist in the 70s, and his body of work still lasts, and it looks about quadrants of attention. And in just a quick summary, humans have 4 quadrants of attention. Really, what is it that we're paying attention to? The first quadrant is what would be called an internal narrow focus. Are we thinking about our body mechanics? Are we thinking about how is our hand holding the axe or the jaws of life? We're thinking very internally about how are we doing some task. That's internally narrow. Internally broad is the next category, which again, we're kind of interfacing our beliefs of how we're acting on some external object. So for example, if I'm doing an extrication on a car, if I'm internally broadly focused, I'm thinking about how am I holding that particular tool in conjunction with maybe breaking a B-pillar. It's internal in design because I'm concerned about how am I using the tool or how am I doing some said skill in relation to what it is I'm trying to impose that on. A lot of us have heard about tunnel vision and the implications and the physiological aspects of tunnel vision. That would be what would be concerned more of an external narrow range of focus. So that if we are not so much preoccupied by our form and our function, but we're concerned about the environment in front of us. If we're acutely focused on one aspect of that, that would be externally narrow focused. The last would be externally broad. A lot of people may tie externally broad attentional focus to situational awareness. Are we relaxed enough, for lack of better words, that we're able to take in the entire environment in front of us and pick up on those cues that are important to us? That would be an external broad quadrant of attention. So then the question is, where should we be operating as firefighters and police officers, especially in those moments where it's stressful, we have to make those critical decisions? I would probably say it's going to operate somewhere between externally narrow and externally broad. We've talked about the implications of choking and panicking. We've talked about the implications of really focusing intently on some set aspect. But if we're not being externally focused, if we're not comfortable and confident, and if we haven't experienced those things in a scenario or through drills and context, when we first experience that, we're going to come back very internally focused to our attributes. And that tends to, can have debilitating effects on how quickly we're able to perform. If this is an area of interest to you, Dr. Gabby Giffords has a wonderful book. It just came out on external focus. And I think you'll find yourself as you lead this presentation in your activities at work and through training you're going through, just spend some time and pay attention to where are you focusing. If you find yourself really focusing on internal stuff, the mechanics of how you're doing something, that's a clue that you have some apprehension of your own skill level. You want to try to be external in your attentional focus. And to bring this all together, that external quadrants of attention are really unconscious. That when we find ourselves, a lot of people will say you're in the groove or you found your niche. You're operating on systems that are unconscious. The amygdala, the frontal cortex are humming in concert, you're performing well, and you've left that realm of focusing intently on specific skill sets. And I think that's so important because laying a foundation of skill sets are important, but we do need to move past that and become elite performers, what I would say in that external realm. And that brings us to our next slide, which is on situational awareness. This next part, situational awareness, could almost be a class in and of itself. We use this term or this vernacular a lot. And I would like to maybe just boil it down to a couple of key takeaways. Situational awareness hinges on what are you perceiving, what are you looking at, and can you make sense of that, and is that important? When we try to teach situational awareness, I think we run the risk of coming at it from a wrong angle to say, just experience said situation and just look all over the place, and by doing that, that will increase your situational awareness. So again, it's not about simply what you see, it's about understanding what you see.
Craig's exactly right. It's not what you see, it's understanding what you see. As you all are probably aware of, in law enforcement we use the OODA loop as a way to describe decision-making process while in conflict. It stands for observation, orientation, decision, and action. That second O, orientation, speaks to what Craig talked about. It's about understanding what we see, putting into context the information that we're taking in. Good training allows us to have looks at problems that give us, on the street, people working, the ability to quickly orient to that problem and then start the process of solving it. It used to be, in our professions, that was literally done by on-the-job training. The more time I had in the field, the more I refined that orientation phase. Well, that's still true, but as trainers, we can speed that process. I'm sure that if you had me riding along in a truck and we arrived to a building that was on fire, and I believe you call it a size up. If you were doing a size up, you as a firefighter would be looking at the exact same thing I would be looking at as a police officer. Big difference though. You would be quickly orienting to what you see and seeing the relevant clues, whether it's color of smoke, where the flames are coming from, maybe you can see what direction the wind's going. All of that would be lost on me because I haven't refined that second part of this OODA loop. I am not able to orient and put into context what I'm seeing. That would put me far behind in the time mechanism to actually influence this situation.
Dr. Gary Klein, he's been around for a long time. In about the 80s, he had spent a lot of time with the fire service, and he was trying to, again, kind of study why is it that some firefighters can have that great situational awareness and make those quick decisions under stress. So at the core of Dr. Klein's work is what's called RPDM, or recognition primed decision making. In a sense, it's not a linear decisional process. It's taking the environment, what it is that we're seeing, and taking those patterns that we've seen before, that we have context of, and then kind of skipping quickly to that decisional process. In a sense, that broadens our situational awareness. So in looking at the OODA loop from Colonel Boyd or Dr. Klein's work in recognition primed decision making, clearly what we see is that training has to capitalize on giving those firefighters those contextual cues in the training for them to rely upon when the amygdala is stimulated and it surges forward to the frontal cortex looking for some sort of context of how to solve this problem. All right, to kind of bring this in summary here, we've talked about the importance of layering, those 4 steps: intellectual understanding, practicing those drills, putting those drills in a context, and then bringing it home in a scenario. That's the core that we believe provides good training. Here's just a quick takeaway. As you're developing this training, what I would always say is sift it through 3 filters. In order to properly stimulate the amygdala, for lack of better words, if we can induce or infuse in the training psychological stressors, physiological stressors, and environmental stressors, if we can get all 3 of those combined, you can almost guarantee that the person or the firefighter will have emotional involvement in their action. The other point to kind of add upon that is let's not just use one of those factors and think that it's going to give us amygdala stimulation. For example, in law enforcement, for a lot of years, for firearms trainings, we would run around the range a bunch and do push-ups with the belief that that physiological arousal, the increase of the heart rate, would somehow replicate what it would be like to be in a gunfight. Entirely not true. In the fire service, maybe it would be training about how to get ladders off the engine and post ladders on a house to attack the window. What I would say is if we're going to practice a drill, maybe it's ventilation. If we could put some sort of ambiguity to the drill, that would be psychological stress. If we could put physiological stress to it, maybe bringing the truck in there, getting off quickly, getting the gear off, attacking the fire, that would be physiological stress because, of course, it takes energy to do that. And environmental stress might be just coming into the situation, not ever seeing it before. If we can get those 3 things combined, again, you're almost guaranteed to stimulate that decisional process. And the key of this is not to dump all the stress on right on the front end, that we want to incrementally put the stress on the firefighter so that aids in their learning process and to give them context when they face that in the field. And the way we increment the stress is precisely this 3rd layer. And in that, those drills and context, slowly put on the psychological, physiological, environmental factors that allow the student to perform in that realm.
A lot of good training is basically setting an environment, having your firefighters experience what they might in the real world. It's very tempting in our professions to try to pile on more complicated techniques, more complicated equipment, more process. Try to steer clear of it. Try as a trainer to understand what it is that's really influencing good performance out in the real world. As we get better as trainers, we can create this ecology of learning where we, like Craig talked about, incrementally increase stressors till in the end we're creating situations that mirror real life situations our firefighters face in the street. So to revisit, it's important that as trainers we need to set an ecology of learning. We got to put into motion the kind of atmosphere and the kind of circumstances that give our firefighters the best ability to learn. We talked about layering before. It's important to understand those fundamental pieces that we talk about in the classroom, that we drill, that we later drill and start to put context to ultimately get tested in scenario-based training. If we find ourselves adding too many techniques, too much equipment that's superfluous or doesn't really cause us to gain anything from it, we're not doing our firefighters any service. Keep things simple, allow them to experience the stress that they would in the real world so that they can move from just reacting to the stress to actually making relevant decisions under that stress. So to bottom line it, we don't want to continue adding to layers 1 and 2. We ultimately want to get to where we're working with 3 and 4. So pick what's important, slowly add the stress, and get to the point where you're really working in that 3 and 4 zone.
This last section just looks at some of the decision models we've looked at. We've looked at UDA, we've looked at Dr. Klein's work, which is the recognition prior decision making. We've looked at naturalistic decision making, which is also an offshoot of Klein's work. At the core of all of those is really allowing the student or the professional to experience their surroundings, pattern match those things that have relevance to them, and come to a quick decision. The volumes of research that we now have at hand clearly demonstrate that we as trainers need to move beyond some of those rote memorization of skills and be operating in more of this experiential learning models. Hopefully with that we can take firefighters in their 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th years and make them as proficient as veterans that have been around for decades. The goal is to consolidate that information, get it to the usable firefighter, and start making quick decisions under stress.
I hope that what we presented today isn't thought of as daunting, or that it's going to be so time-consuming and so complicated that it's not going to be reality. We understand the realities. Like firefighters, police officers, we have time, budget constraints. We have a lot of mandatory training we have to get in with our officers. But the nice thing about what we talked about here today, we can do this in increments. It doesn't have to be one big evolution to achieve everything we talked about in this layering approach. And in fact, most research would show that as adults, we're going to learn better by having more micro trainings as opposed to longer individual slots of training. So you can look at this layered approach, take components of it, work with your firefighters, and do it in increments till you're finally increasing the amount of exposure they have over time and building them towards that scenario-based training.
Both Bert and I want to thank you guys. It's been our pleasure to be with you here today. At Hillsborough, both the fire service and the police service, we've been working together quite extensively on some of these different training models, layering approach, having a more unified vision at training. So if you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Roberto or myself or even the fire department.